Hello everyone, this is Muhammad Wasim Khan, an instructor of Human Resource Management course. As we know, when different organizations want to recruit or select different candidates, they organize different screening tests and interviews. In today's lecture, we will talk about one of the most important topics, and the topic is interviewing candidates for particular jobs and positions. After studying this chapter, we will be able to list the main types of selection interviews, explain factors that affect the usefulness of interviews, discuss the guidelines for an effective interviewer, and effectively interview a job candidate. An interview is more than a discussion. An interview is a procedure designed to obtain information from a person through oral responses to oral inquiries. Employers use several interviews at work, such as performance appraisal interviews and exit interviews. A selection interview is a selection procedure designed to predict future job performance based on applicants' oral responses to oral inquiries. So let's first discuss the definition of an interview. An interview is a procedure which is designed to obtain information from an applicant or candidate by asking him or her different questions. So an interview is actually a process through which the interviewer obtain information regarding the candidate by asking him or her different types of questions. We have three different types of interviews. The first one is selection interview. We will focus on selection interview in this particular lecture. The second one is appraisal interview, and the third one is exit interview. Appraisal and exit interview, we will discuss these two types of interviews in the coming lectures. Let's talk about the two main formats of interview. The first one is structured and the second one is unstructured. So let's discuss different types of interviews. Selection interview is a selection process based on the applicant's answers to the questions. Appraisal interview is actually a discussion following a performance appraisal in which supervisor and employee discuss the employee's rating and possible corrective actions. An exit interview, interview a departing employee to get information about job-related matters to give the company some insight into what is right or wrong about the company. Let's discuss two most important format of interviews. So the first one is unstructured or non-directive interview, and the second one is a structured or directive interview. An unstructured conversational style interview in which an interviewer discusses different points of interest as they come up in response to the questions. Interviewer asks questions as they come to mind, generally with no set format. So in an unstructured interview, the interviewer asks random questions. And these questions are actually based on the responses of the previous questions of the candidate. So in this type of format, the interviewer do not set a particular sequence of questions for a particular candidate. On the other hand, a structured interview follow a set sequence of questions. Even acceptable responses are specified in advance and the responses may be rated for appropriateness. In structured interview, the interviewer have already set a particular sequence of questions for a candidate, and they will ask those type of questions from a particular candidate. So there is a main difference between the structured and unstructured interviews. And the difference is actually the set sequence of questions. We can classify selection interviews according to how structured they are, as we have discussed in the previous slides. It was the format of interviews. The second is their content, mean the types of questions they contain. And the third one is how the firm administers the interview. So we have discussed the first category, that was the structured or unstructured interviews. Now let's discuss the interview content or types of questions that may be asked in a particular interview. So types of interview based on content. We have 4 types of interviews based on the content. The first one is job related interview. In which interviewer tries to deduce what the applicants on the job performance will be by listening to their answers to questions about past behaviors. The second one is situational interview, in which the candidates are asked what their behavior would be in a particular situation. The third one is a behavioral interview. The candidates are asked how they have reacted to actual situations in the past. And the fourth and the last one is the stress interview. Interviewer tries to make the applicants uncomfortable with rude questions in order to find their stress tolerance. As a lecturer, I have faced three of these types of interviews. So let's talk about the advantages and disadvantages of the structured or directive interview. We will discuss the advantages first. More reliable and valid. The structured or directive interviews are more reliable and valid, help those less comfortable doing interviews. So it will help those candidates who are not very comfortable with interviews. Increase consistency across candidates. It will enhance the job relatedness because interviewers usually set the questions regarding a particular job. Okay, and it will reduce the biasness as well. The disadvantage of a structured interview is that it do not always provide opportunity to follow up on points of interest as they develop. So let's discuss the situational interview. Situational interview is a series of job-related questions that focus on how the candidate would behave in a given situation. It describes a situation that illustrates your ability to analyze and solve a particular problem. You might ask a candidate for a supervisor position how he or she would react to a subordinate calling to work late 3 days in a row. So in a situational interview, the interviewer usually provide a particular situation to the candidate through which the interviewer know how the candidate can solve a particular problem or face a particular situation. Behavioral interview, as the name suggests, here the behavior of a candidate is usually analyzed. So a series of job-related questions that focus on how they reacted or behaved to actual situations in the past. For example, did you ever have a situation in which a subordinate came in late? If so, how did you handle that particular situation? So here, a situation is provided to the candidate, and the interviewer wants to know how the candidate handled that particular situation. Tell me about a time you were speaking with an irate person and you turned the situation around. And describe a situation where you had to deal with someone who you felt was dishonest. How did you handle it? So these were some of the examples of some of the situations that a particular interviewer can provide it to the candidate. Job-related interview, as the name suggests, it is a series of job-related questions that focus on relevant past job-related behaviors. Knowledge and background questions probe candidates' job-related knowledge and experience, as in what math course did you take in college? So, for example, you are an interviewer and you want to hire a particular person for a job of a lecturer, mathematics lecturer. So you may ask the candidate, what math courses did you take in college? So you are actually asking about the experiences of that particular candidate in that particular position or area. Stress interview. And this is actually an interview type which I have actually faced in different organizations. So let's discuss the stress interview. An interview in which the interviewer seeks to make the applicant uncomfortable with occasionally rude questions that supposedly to spot sensitive applicants and those with low or high stress tolerance. So in this type of interview, actually, in this type of interview, actually, the interviewer wants to know the stress tolerance level of a particular candidate. Now let's talk about snap judgments, what actually the snap judgment is. Snap judgment is also called the first impressions. Perhaps the most consistent finding is that interviewers tend to jump to conclusions, make snap judgments about candidates during the first few minutes of the interview. One researcher estimates that in 85% of the cases, interviewers had made up their minds before the interview even began. Based on first impressions, the interviewers gleaned from candidates' applications and personal appearance. In one typical study, giving interviewers the candidates' test scores biased the ultimate assessment of the candidate. In another study, interviewers judged candidates who they were told formerly suffered from depression or substance abuse more negatively. So first impression is the last impression. That's why we actually recommend to different students that if you want to go for an interview, your first impression should be very impressive. So to make good impression, you do not even get a time to open your mouth. Interviewer response will be pre-verbal, walk through the door, your body posture, yeah, your body language should be very positive. Okay, there should be a smile on your face, attractive appearance. If you should wear a nice dress, firm, confident handshake. You can shake the hand with a confidence. And interviewers usually make up their minds about interview during the first few minutes. So that's why we can say that first impression is the last impression. Okay, this is a structured interview guide. It is actually a sample of the structured interview. So you can, go through this particular sample. You can find some other samples, in Google search. So I would like to give you a home assignment or task to go through different structured interview guides so that you know how actually a structured interview guide is. Okay, so this is actually a continued format or sample of a structured interview. Okay, so we have discussed the two important things, that is the format of interview and the contents of the interview. Now let's discuss administering the interviews. Okay, the first one is individual interview, which is actually a one-on-one interview. The second one is sequential interview, that is like the unstructured interview and the structured interview. The third one is panel interview or mass interview. Panel interview, actually in panel interview, we can have a group of interviewers. Okay, the telephonic interview, computerized interview. Okay, we can have the video or online interview on Skype or Zoom or MS Microsoft Teams. Okay, so let's discuss the unstructured sequential interview. An unstructured sequential interview is an interview in which each interviewer made an independent opinion about after asking different questions. And in structured sequential interview is an interview in which the applicant is interviewed in a sequence by several persons. Each rates the applicant on a standard form. So we have discussed these two types of interviews earlier. Let's talk about the panel interview. A panel interview is an interview in which a group of interviewers ask the questions from different applicants. A panel interview is a group of is an interview in which the group of interviewers asks these questions, and mass interview is a panel interview several candidates simultaneously. So when a panel or group of interviewers simultaneously take interview of different candidates, so that is actually a mass interview. And telephone interview is a more accurate and practical form of interview, and neither side need worry about the things like clothing and shake hands. Like if you want, if any interviewer want to uh, you know ask you different questions or take an interview of you, so you don't need to worry about the clothing and handshake, because obviously the interview will not see you on telephone. Yeah, so okay, phone interview may let both focus more on meaningful answers, but the telephonic interviews are not very common nowadays, because usually the interviews are held, the telephonic interviews are actually transferred to the video call interviews on Zoom or Microsoft Teams software, or on Skype, etc. Okay, computerized selection interview is an interview in which a job candidate's oral and or computerized replies are obtained in response to computerized oral, visual, or written questions and or situations. So its characteristics are reduce actually the amount of time managers devote to interviewing unacceptable candidates. Applicants are more honest with computers and avoid problems to interpersonal interviews. Mechanical nature of computer-aided interview can leave an applicant dissatisfied. So these were some of the characteristics of computerized selection interviews. Okay, let's talk about the different factors that affect an interview. One of the factor is a first impression. We have already discussed this one. The second one is the poor knowledge of the job. The third one is the candidate order error. The fourth one is pressure to hire. The next one is impression of non-verbal behavior. And another one is the effect of personal characteristics and interviewer behavior. So let's discuss each of these factors one by one. First impression, the tendency for interviewers to jump to the conclusions or make the snap judgments about candidates during the first few minutes of an interview. So actually interviewer, jump into the conclusion in the first few minutes of an interview. And it is based on the first impressions from the candidate towards the interviewer. Okay, let's talk about the negative biasness of the first impression. Unfavorable information about an applicant influences interviews more than does positive information. So this is actually, I would say, a negative side of the first impression. The second factor is pressure to hire, like lower expectations to fill the targeted numbers quickly. Okay, the third one is poor knowledge of job. Usually the interviewer do not have complete knowledge of the job, and unfortunately I have experienced this particular factor in an interview in different organizations, that a different interviewer do not know about that particular job. They do not have a sufficient knowledge about that particular job, and that's why they can't honestly, or I would say accurately, select a particular person for a particular job. So not knowing precisely what the job entails and what sort of candidate is best suited causes interviewers to make decisions based on incorrect stereotypes of what a good applicant is. Okay, candidate order error. This is another factors affect an interview. Um, Candidate order, or it is also called contrast error, means that the order in which you see applicants affects how you rate them. In one study, managers had to evaluate a candidate who was just average after first evaluating several unfavorable candidates. They scored the average candidate more favorably than they might otherwise have done, because in contrast to the unfavorable candidates, the average one looked better than he actually was. So this contrast effect can be huge. In some early studies, evaluator based only a small a part of the applicant's rating on his or her actual potentials. Okay, non-verbal behavior and impression management. The applicant's non-verbal behavior, like smiling, avoiding your gaze, and so on, can also have a surprisingly large impact on his or her rating. In one study, 52 human resource specialists watched video tapped job interviews in which the applicant's verbal content was identical, but their non-verbal behavior differed markedly. Researchers told applicants in one group to exhibit minimal eye contact, a low energy level, and high voice modulation. Um, and those in a second group demonstrated the opposite behavior. 23 of the 26 personal specialists who saw the high eye contact, high energy level candidate would have invited him or her for a second interview. None who saw the low eye contact, low energy level candidate would have recommended a second interview. Okay, so it certainly seems to pay interviewees to look alive. Let's talk about the impression management. You know, clever candidates capitalized on that fact. One study found that some used ingratiation to persuade interviewers to like them. For instance, the candidates praised the interviewers or appeared to agree with their opinions. Ingratiations also involves, for example, agreeing with the recruiter's opinions and thus signaling they share similar beliefs. Sensing that a perceived similarity in attitudes may influence how the interviewer rates them, some interviewers try to emphasize or fabricate such similarities. Others make self-promoting comments about their own accomplishments. Self-promotion means promoting one's own skills and abilities to create the impression of competence. Um, okay, I think that was enough for the impression management. Okay, let's talk about the effect of personal characteristics, attractiveness, gender, and race. Unfortunately, physical attributes such as applicants' attractiveness, gender, disability, or race may also distort their assessments. For example, people usually ascribe more favorable traits and more successful life outcomes to attractive people. Similarly, race can play a role depending on how you conduct the interview. In one study, for example, the white members of a racially balanced interview panel rated white candidates higher, while the black interviewers rated black candidates higher. In all cases, structured interviews produce less of the difference between minority and white interviews than did unstructured interviews. And let's talk about the last factor, and the factor is the interviewer behavior. So unintentionally telegraph expected answers. Yes, talk so much that applicants have no time to answer the question. Yes, this is the second point is very common in most of the interviews. Because the interviewers talk so much and they do not give particular sufficient time to the applicants to answer that particular question, and let the applicant dominate the interview and act more positively toward a favorable or ideal applicant. So that is actually a kind of biasness. So yes, that is actually a particular interviewer behavior, which is a factor that may affect an interview. In the second and last part of this lecture, inshallah, we will discuss designing and conducting the interview. Till then, thank you. Bye-bye.